Welcome back to Screen View Mirror. I'm your host, Emma,
And I'll be your co-host, Patrick.
and you're listening to Screen View Thoughts. It's great to be back. So, today on the podcast, we are going to be doing a double feature on Michelangelo Antonioni. And we've picked out two wonderful Antonioni films, and we're going to be comparing and contrasting them. The first film is The Eclipse from 1962, and that's basically the last film of his so-called Alienation trilogy. So it starts with La Ventura, then they have then there's La Notte, and then of course The Eclipse, L'Eclipse, and the second film we're going to be doing is Red Desert from 1964. And in chronological order, let's begin with The Eclipse, which is the last film in this trilogy of alienation and incommunicability. Patrick, do you want to start us off on this one?
I think before diving into this conversation, I think I have to preface by just kind of briefly saying that my experience with these movies was a little weird. Like, I recognized the importance of them, and I quite enjoyed a lot of them, but I really had a bit of a hard time connecting with them. And I think that's actually quite appropriate. And like there were moments where I felt deep love for them, but ultimately there was like an apathy and a certain distance, and I feel like weirdly that's actually kind of perfect. I think it's a really apt metaphor for what Antonioni's relationships are like presented as here. So you know what? I'm taking this as like as a win. I'm taking this as a good thing that I can't quite connect to these movies as much as I have with some others, kind of in the same way that his characters just cannot seem to connect with each other. I think that's kind of perfect.
Yeah, I think that's part of the point of a lot of Antonioni's films, including these two that we're doing in our little double feature podcast today. The fact that the audience can't connect with the film, and especially with the characters in the film, is only reflecting how the characters feel about each other and their surroundings. And the wonderful thing that we see in The Eclipse is the mise en scène and how Antonioni uses images and he uses architecture and the surrounding space to basically block characters from each other. So if you remember the scene at the stock exchange where Vittoria first meets Piero, there's a huge column in between them, and we have Victoria and her mother on the left side, Piero on the right hand side with like another stockbroker there, and the frame is not dominated by the characters, but it's dominated by a giant bulky piece of rock or marble or whatever it was that stands between the two characters. So this kind of idea of objects and technology and modernity alienating people from each other is very much present in both films, I'd say.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up because one of the things that stuck out to me, I remember from the Eclipse, it's in my notes right here also, was the way that those beams in the stock market scene like really play into the composition. And like it's exactly as you're saying, like it separates the characters. It takes up, it's essentially like it towers over the rest of the frame as this like big symbol of like capitalist architecture. It's really quite an interesting image there. And no, the stock exchange scenes were some of my favorite scenes in the movie, which is ironic because I've read some responses to this film that like that people saying like they loved everything except stock exchange scenes. But I don't know, they're almost really funny to me. There's like everything else in the film is really restrained, and then the chaos of the economy is like just pure frenzy. It's quite fun.
Right. And
I honestly think that like, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
And I think that plays into like, I know that Antonioni's, trilogy is about this is mainly about modernity, but I really think that what stuck out to me about these films a bit more than just that was the relationship between, you know, romance and like capitalism, you know, like this sort of these people kind of wandering in this like in this system of like needing to kind of just get a job and do whatever, you know. So that this, I think, the fact that that's where the characters meet and that it sort of is a tonal shift from the rest of the film is a really interesting choice that I find really elevates some of the themes going on around it. You know?
It's interesting that you mentioned the relationship between romance and capitalism, because to me, though on the surface level you could say that okay, the movie is sort of about it follows a relationship, or like the end of a relationship and the beginning of an affair, or another relationship, sort of same storyline with Red Desert. But is are these movies about relationships and love in the romantic sense? Are these movies about relationships? Because I'd say they're about the relationship of people to people and the relationship of people to their surroundings, but not the relationship of in the romantic sense. So I don't think that we're looking at
girlfriend.
right. I don't think we're looking at the relationship between romance and capitalism. I think we're looking at the relationship between people and the modernity that encloses them. And then from there on out, you could say that, okay, well, for example, in Red Desert, Juliana's desire for what's the guy's name, Corrado, that's a consequence of her inability to cope with the alienation she feels, and her inability to kind of sustain her sanity in post-war life, right? But I think that all forms of quote unquote romantic desire in both films are merely a consequence of any existential alienation that the characters feel. And the difference between the lead female character and the lead male character in both movies, I'd say, is that the lead female character is the one that's aware of her problem. Right? Because you could compare with L'Eclipse, you could sort of compare the character of I think his name was Piero, the guy that she breaks up with at the start of the film. You could kind of compare him to Thomas in Blow Up, like this kind of eccentric or distanced artist who isn't really aware of how he feels. And then versus Victoria, she's very much aware of, I think, what she wants, and what she wants is kind of, I guess a kind of freedom and a purpose, which she can't find in her relationships, which maybe then in turn drive her to want to engage in a relationship with the other guy. What's his name? The one played by Alain Delon.
Actually, sorry. I just looked on the IMDb page. That's actually Piero.
Oh, sorry.
She breaks up with at the beginning. Yeah, the man she breaks up with at the beginning is Ricardo.
Yeah, Ricardo. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that's what kind of leads her to want that relationship with Piero, I guess. That's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, I definitely like a lot of the points you're making there, because there's such a loneliness and an ennui to the entirety of L'Eclipse. Even when like sorry, I keep referring to it by like its Italian name. It's very pretentious of me, but yeah, there's like an ennui and a loneliness to so much of it, and the relationship between, you know, humans engaging with one another and humans engaging their surroundings, as you're talking about, is really interesting. Because like there's a few moments that I noted down that I really like, that I think on what you're talking about here, which is in the second stock exchange scene, again, kind of back to that whole stock market thing, but there's like everything's kind of going like awful, right? Like the stocks are like plummeting,
right?
And everyone's in like disarray. It's absolute chaos. And then on the phone with someone, Piero says, "Miss, you're a fucking whore if you don't get Milan on the line now." which just really struck me as like such a sharp contrast to how he like talks to how am I forgetting her name? How he talks to Victoria.
Victoria, yeah.
And so it's kind of like this. It's this really weird moment where like we're really watching the economy crash in a sense, and watching everyone desperately try to hang on. And it almost like positions Antonioni's like romances as these hopeless desires perched on this edge of like turbulent, transformative social times, where it like feels like everything's about to cascade off the edge.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's kind of
And
the.
also,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, sorry. Another quick thing in the same sort of vein was that was just how like I think the film reaches its most like meditative sort of tones when we're really just watching Victoria like wander around, you know, like completely alone. I think that talks like the sort of the romantic soul's experience in like the rigors of like such an institutionalized society where it's like I'm just kind of walking around and I'm watching people do this and that and the other thing, and like I'm completely alone, you know.
Yeah.
While everyone's just going about their life, it's like wandering in search of something elusive that while ultimately being like isolated and alone, you know.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I do think that the Eclipse is basically a film of contrasts. You've got the empty
Mm-hmm.
modern space, and then you've got the bustling energy of the Roman Stock Exchange, and the actual plot and the storyline. Temporally, it's very difficult to put your finger on how much time passes between the events and what the events actually are. I mean, she goes on this plane trip to, I think it was Verona, and then you see her back in Rome, or you see Piero back in Rome, and the whole thing is just completely disjointed. And the lack of precision in, or the lack of classical storytelling, if you will, and the difficulty to track the time of the story is, I think, very telling of how she herself might have felt in her environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas you might have had with, for example, the Italian neorealist films of the 40s and the 50s, you might have had more quote unquote real story arcs, right? Take Bicycle Thieves, for example. But here,
exactly what I was about to say. Yeah,
yeah. But here, that's not the case anymore, and it's not even the case. He's barely even making a social commentary or a political commentary. I mean, you take a movie like Red Desert, you could make a whole political commentary on that, but Antonioni kind of brushes that. I can't say to the side. I can't say that it's not a social commentary, but it's definitely, you can see that he's more interested in the metaphysical aspect of it all rather than the concrete socio-political commentary that could be made of post-war life in 60s Italy. And that also goes to show that, okay, the apathy and the existentialism of the plot, or the lack thereof, and the storyline is different to the type of storyline that you could see with Vittorio De Sica, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in a sense, almost in a sense, the politics of the film kind of become just about this like transcendence beyond rigorous politics in a way, which is kind of interesting,
right?
Kind of ironic, but like it's interesting. So, and I love that you bring up the structure because I had just mentioned Victoria as this wanderer, and I think the plot is a wanderer as well, in its own film. It very much doesn't confine itself to a particular structure. It kind of just moves around, which is really interesting in relation to how Antonioni sort of conceives of these human relationships between people. There was another quick little thing I wanted to touch on for the Eclipse, if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
There's something about the relationship between Vittoria and Piero that I really just find so interesting, and it's about kind of their contrasting perspectives, but also their lack of communication. And because there's a moment, I have like a few things I noted down in regards to this. There's a moment when Piero's car is lifted out of the water, and there's the body of the drunk man inside, and his hand is like sticking out, and that moment really resonated for me because I was like, okay, something about it like shifted how I felt about the movie. It was like, okay, something is like stuff. This is starting to be like a darker film, like this is like, and I feel like it really resonates for Victoria too because she shared a human moment with this guy she's never met, never had a conversation with. She shared like a human sort of experience of wave, smile,
Right.
And so as they're walking away from the crash site, she asks him, "You're thinking about the dents?" And he says, "I'm thinking about the time and the money." So like she's concerned with this guy died, and I'm
Yeah.
like I feel weird about it, and he's concerned with, oh well, this is going to cost me a bunch.
Yeah.
And that similarly, like much later on in the movie, I think they they walk around together so much, but like there's a moment where Pierre kind of wants to stop walking and like talk to her, and the quote I noted down was, "You mind telling me what's wrong?" And she says, "Nothing. Let's walk a bit." So like she almost refuses to communicate any of what she feels to him. And then the last, I have like a whole list here of things I want to touch on with this. The last thing that's super interesting when it comes to this theme of communication is I think Piero asks her, "How do you say 'Can I come inside' in Spanish?" And she says, "You say you can't. It's a tough language." And she says that as like a kind of joke, but
Yeah.
it's really an interesting moment for me in terms of this lack of communication they have. Like she like manipulates language almost. All the way you say that in Spanish is you say you can't come in. Like it, it's a very sort of funny moment that shows just how little communication there is between them, which I think again plays to so much to what you've been talking about this isolation and this sort of drawing into oneself.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up because this film is really since unlike Red Desert, it's not in color; it's in black and white. So you have that restriction on what you can show and how you can show it. But at the same time, the black and white allows you to make certain aspects of your mise en scène pop. And what you say there with the lack of communication, that I think is also exemplified by the mise en scène. So the scene that I mentioned, for example, with the stock exchange where they were separated by the pillar, or also the scene where they were like kissing and there was a glass in between their faces, so they were kissing the glass. I mean, it's literally an object obstructing them. It's uncanny how the way objects and spaces in this film are used to convey the message. I mean, almost so much that the characters become the props and the objects become the vessels for the story. And the interesting thing in that commentary is that you could say that's what post-war, post-modern life became, where the object almost superseded the human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's really a strong argument. That's fantastic stuff. Yeah, I loved the glass scene so much where they kiss through the glass, and I hadn't thought about it in that context. That's really something fantastic. Yeah, wow. So I'm looking through my notes here to see if there's anything else worth talking about with that one. There's some other things that are interesting too, but I think are almost more interesting in terms of comparing to Red Desert in a sense.
Right.
Like I don't know how comparative you were hoping to get here, but there's some things that are.
Go for it.
First of all, you mentioned I'm going to jump off something you said to sort of transition into a bit of comparison here, because you talked about the cinematography being so different in both films, which was something that I noted down like almost immediately when I started Red Desert.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too that first of all, the titles very much reflect that, right?
Yeah.
Eclipse, Red Desert, and then more than that, but there's also I get the sense that the cinematography echoes these titles, and these titles in the cinematography also sort of echo the tones and the sort of views on human connection seen in the actual films themselves. Because like if we dissect the titles, like the Eclipse, we just like the pure darkness, like blocking out the sun, blocking out the light for like a very specific period of like the lunar cycle, and then Red Desert, right? This empty sort of desert, but still like a very vibrant red. And I think there was so much that interested me about that. And I think that goes. It's just a really strong, I think, jumping off point for while these films are similar in many ways. I think that just so much about them is so different. The music strikes me in that way too, where like in the Eclipse, it's like very classical almost, like just in how it sounds, and in the Red Desert, it's like pure like electronic.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of more eerie, I guess, with with Red Desert. But that's very interesting that you mentioned the titles, because if you think about an eclipse, that's it's almost like a verb, because it happens over a given period of time, and it's a process that ends, and therefore it has a flow, and it's something natural. Whereas a red desert, I mean, I don't know, but I don't imagine that such a thing naturally exists on planet Earth. So that's something much more punctuating and vibrant, and it's not a process. It's a click, a snapshot of something, right? And
so like it's like an imagined landscape of sorts.
Exactly, and that kind of when I watched Red Desert, it made me think a lot about Zabriskie Point, which is another one of Antonioni's films, and I did a video essay on that and how objects play into the modern space. Except in Zabriskie Point, there's a lot more contrast between the modern space and the natural space versus Red Desert. You have that one scene with the story of the girl at the beach, but aside from that, you're basically in an industrial fog, and any color that you get in the film is very sparse. You've got that beautiful scene with the red in the boat, but that's the thing with Red Desert. It uses color to its advantage.
Absolutely.
And the fact that most of the film is gray and foggy, especially that wonderful ending, that just reflects the mind frame of the main character. So
yeah. You mentioned the wonderful ending. I'll also like to mention the wonderful opening title sequence, which was like maybe my favorite part of that movie. I don't know why, but it really has that same sort of foggy like vibe that you're talking about. Love that you're talking about the colors, because I think that's really important. And there were a few moments that stuck out to me of like the visual motif of like red as a color. There's the scene that I believe you just mentioned, where it's Juliana and like a bunch of other people sort of just like all lying around with the red wall. There's also fire that's seen as red in like a few short shots.
Yeah, like the very opening scene.
Exactly, yeah. And also, there's one shot which I think to me is the most important when it comes to the idea of red. It's a shot of Juliana's face, and behind her is like all these red like sort of construction machines, or like so, I don't know exactly what it was. It was like an incredibly like industrial object of like construction.
Yeah,
that's like full red behind her, and I thought that plays into the title of Red Desert so much, right? And sort of to what Antonioni is getting at with that idea.
Yeah, because she's the one that's sort of deserted in herself and her frame of mind, and yet surrounded by all of this industrial modernity and whatnot. And again, as I said, like this could have been a very strong socio-political commentary, but I feel like the film was much more philosophical than it was political. And that's also what Mark Lefanu, writing in 2010 for Criterion, said about the film, that it was very philosophical rather than political. And you had those undertones, but it ultimately, I think, was a commentary about post-war life and the kind of deranged spiral that the protagonist fell into.
Yeah, I'm just realizing another interesting dimension to this idea of colors that we've been touching on just now. There's a quote that that I wrote down when I cannot remember the man's name. Let's take a look here. Corrado.
Yeah.
Yes. Corrado asks Juliana what she's afraid of. And her exact response is streets, factories, colors, everything. And I just think that's fascinating. In the contrast from this to the Eclipse, right? That this is in color, and the other one's in black and white. In the notion of the expanse of the modernist landscape, with the streets and the factories, and in the symbolism of this red that we've discussed. I think that's like a really important quote for us to touch on.
That fits in very well with what he asked her on the boat scene, where he said, "Sometimes I wonder if it isn't pointless taking our work so seriously. Do you find it absurd too?" And she responds with, "I feel like my eyes are all wet. What do people expect me to do with my eyes? What am I supposed to look at?" And then he responds, "You wonder what to look at. I wonder how to live. It's the same thing." And that's why the movie was in color. Because he could have made the Eclipse in color too, but everything, I think, is a deliberate choice, and that's why Red Desert was in color. And that's also why you kind of get a more of a Sartrean existentialist feel with this movie, I feel like. So
definitely.
Yeah, I'm not saying that that's why the movie was in color, that, for the sake of the dialogue, he had to film the thing in color. No, I'm saying that this dialogue is indicative of how the characters felt themselves about the surroundings and modernity in their lives, and this whole kind of use of color to convey characters' POV and emotion simply complements what was expressed in that dialogue.
Right. Yeah. I'm kind of chuckling at the notion that Antonioni Antonioni making that choice simply because, oh, look, I have this in the dialogue. But no, I get what you mean. But it's like,
because he could have, he could have still had the movie in black and white and still included that dialogue.
Yeah, it's the philosophical undertone.
Yeah, it's exactly.
We feel about it. Yeah. Also, another thing that's sticking out to me that I want to bring up, and it talks to the notion of just of what's the word I'm looking for here? Solitude, isolation. There we go. I think this is closer to the end of the film, but there's a point where Juliana says, "I'm not a single woman, but sometimes I feel separated. No, not from my husband. Our bodies are all separated, right? So it's not from her husband. So it's not just like a romantic disconnection. Our bodies are all separated.
Yeah.
Now that's crazy, because then there's like a physical association to that, then, right? Because then it becomes like, it's not just that like socially, emotionally there's distance between people. It's literally like physically we are not in the same bodies,
Exactly. And I think that in terms of the mise en scène, that separation with Red Desert is achieved with the sheer emptiness of all of those spaces that the characters find themselves in. I mean, the one scene where they're all kind of cramped together is the boat scene, because they're literally on a boat, so there's only so much space. But everywhere else, the fields and everywhere, it's so empty. And even the shop that she tried to start up, like, the walls are plain, they're all empty, there's nothing in there. It's empty, it's hollow, there's no purpose, there's no meaning, it's just a void. of ennui. It's just a void, right? So in Red Desert, that separation is, I think, conveyed by the emptiness of the frames, whereas in the Eclipse, that separation from people and their reality, or people and each other, is conveyed by the use of buildings and objects as um, intrusive and obstructive instruments between and among characters.
Right. Yeah.
So you have like that piece of glass or that window or whatever it was separating Piero and Vittoria in the Eclipse, and that's a kind of separation. But then the separation in Red Desert is a lot more profound because they're separated from themselves by virtue of being in a void of its own, kind of like they're in an empty room or an empty field with very few people in there, and that's kind of indicative of the separation, I think.
Absolutely, I think you're spot on with that. You talk in a way there also. You're kind of circling back to the notion of color, right? You talked about it for a second there too. The walls in her shop and everything, but I think the notion of like there's so much going on there that I really like in everything you just said, and I think I just spotted another quote that's I think relevant to what you're talking about in the sense of like the void of ennui and also harkening back to your point about people and objects. There's a line where like Juliana is absolutely going through it, like she's not feeling great, and which is most of the movie, but like she's particularly having a bad time here, and Corrado like asks her, like, I don't remember what he asks exactly, like it was like, how can I help, or what do you want, or something like that, she's like, what's wrong? And she says, I want everyone who's ever cared about me here now around me like a wall.
Right.
And so you've talked about these objects of separation, right? Walls, beams, glass. And here she almost wants to conceptualize the wall as like a force of like healing, force of love. If you make that wall human, but like it can't exist almost. Like she needs everyone that's ever cared about her to surround her with love, but like she can't have that. It's quite a sad line, honestly. But I think it's so relevant to this conversation.
And it conveys the fact that identity is relative to everyone else. So we understand ourselves as what we are not, and we understand what we are not in relation to what others are. So of course, if you feel isolated, alienated, separate, as she said, it's because it makes sense that she would want those people there, because she wants to know who she is, and she can only know that in relation to everyone else around her. And there aren't much people in the film itself. Like, we don't see her friends. Well, there's her son, but then what are her friends? Like, she doesn't have friends in that movie. We don't see her parents, we don't see her family, we don't see her friends, her colleagues. No, just her husband, the workers that her husband manages, and the Corrado guy, and that's it. And her son. And for a movie in color, it's a surprisingly colorless movie, and I also think that that's why he made the choice to make Red Desert in color. It's to show that here, if this movie was in color, it would be colorless. It would be entirely gray.
Right. Yeah. I love that. That's a great point.
Which sends a stronger message.
Emma, I feel like we're on very similar wavelengths here, because what you just were saying literally transitions perfectly into something I wanted to quickly talk about.
Oh, amazing. Okay.
And so you just mentioned identity, right? And identity more specifically in relation to others around us, right? There's one line from the very beginning of the movie that says, like, you have to learn to love something or someone, or maybe the opposite. I don't remember. Learn to love someone or something. Like it can be a son, it can be a husband. I think like somebody that says it could be a dog. Like just love someone or something, right?
Right.
So it's kind of about like finding who you are, finding your purpose. To go back to your idea of existentialism,
right?
Finding like who you are, finding your purpose through like your relations to the people around you, right? She has to be, the right sort of mom in a sense to her child that she's taking care of, and that's like her sort of gendered responsibility socially. And she has to like fill the roles in her romantic relationships. It really, I think, sends an existential message about our identity in relation to other people. And I think, I know your podcast is very interested in philosophy, so you might like me for name dropping Nietzsche here, but the films to me come off as very nihilistic in the sense that,
yes,
here is this, quote unquote God. Here is this all encompassing purpose. Find someone to love, right?
Yeah.
And then here's the God is dead because modernity prevents us from feeling that connection fully,
Remember when we did the podcast on Kubrick and War, and we did Fear and Desire? Remember that scene in Fear and Desire where there are two soldiers and they're looking out into the horizon with a pair of binoculars, and they see a general, an enemy general, and they can tell because it's a different uniform. And I can't remember exactly what they said, but they said something along the lines of, oh, okay, now we know what to do with our mission or whatever. That's who we attack.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's very, to drop another name, a la Carl Schmitt, who basically said that, we understand ourselves in relation to the enemy, right? And in both a political sense, but you could also translate that idea into identity terms. Those soldiers understood who they were and what their purpose was in relation to the fact that they saw that enemy general, and so they were like, okay, now we know what we need to do. We live to kill him. That's that.
Yeah.
And that's why
Absolutely.
Juliana wanted a room full of people, enclosing her, like. That's why she wanted a wall of people, so she could know what to do with herself, and so she could know who she was. I mean, Sartre wrote this in, I think it was Being and Nothingness, that the look of the other is really what, how we realize who we are, because we perceive the feeling of being looked at, and then it's like, boom, now I know my identity. And then of course later with I'm sure you've seen Cleo from 5 to 7.
Actually, I have not.
You
haven't? I'm disappointed in myself for that, but please carry on.
Okay, well, backstory, there's this woman who's waiting for the test results of, I think it's a cancer test or something like that, and the movie follows her from 5 to 7. A lot of the movie is her reflected in mirrors, broken mirrors, and guys basically looking at her. And so Varda's commentary on that kind of follows from Simone de Beauvoir, who translated basically Sartre's look into the male gaze, right? And so that idea is the same. It's just the gendered application of the idea that, okay, I understand my identity because someone else is looking at me, and from that look, I can tell what I'm not. So now I know what I am. And it's kind of like this being as an understanding, as a negative understanding, right? It's being through negation, which goes back to why Carl Schmitt said, okay, it's the enemy tells us who we are. And then from there on out, we understand why those binoculars and the look of the other, right, told those soldiers what their purpose was. The self is not an island. That's why she wanted a wall of people around her, because she was an island.
Right.
And the self can't be an island. So that's the idea.
That's some fascinating connections there. I really like the way you brought in those other films there, and I think it's so relevant to this film, particularly because, like, you know, this idea of othering and of, you know, of looking at one another to sort of create one another, particularly even in the gendered sense that you talked about from Cleo to from Patch 7. I think that's relevant in films as well. And I think it's just it really creates, I think, an idea that these films are interested in, you know, identity and purpose as a social connection. But then when that sort of starts to fall away in disconnect and in solitude, well, then what happens in that purposelessness? Well, then, you know, these characters and this film, and they just wander. These characters in these films, they wander. That's what happens. You know, they just kind of become these
exactly
floating, wandering, in search of connection, in search of purpose. It's really a fascinating relationship there.
I mean, it's the old if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Right?
Right.
we bestow the sound upon the falling tree. If we didn't have any of that philosophy and any of those other films to compare and contrast and analyze this movie, what could we actually say about this movie? Question mark. Would this movie exist? Question mark. Right?
Exactly. Such a great point. Yeah, the way these characters look at the other people around them to define themselves. Obviously, the film, like any film, does the same. You just mentioned the you know, the age old, you know, if the tree falls, etc., etc. That reminds me of the story that Juliana tells her son.
Oh yeah.
The girl who's swimming, who's, you know, sort of, you know, I think there's a line she says that's like, you know, she didn't really like anyone in, like, that she was around, so she just kind of would, like, swim alone.
Right.
And this little, I don't actually know how old the girl is. I don't remember if that's said, but the girl kind of just swims alone. She's off on an island, you know, and pardon the contemporary phrase, but she's literally just vibing. And, like, you know, there's a boat that arrives and it's empty and then it just leaves.
Yeah.
There's a voice that's coming and singing somewhere around her, but there's no one on the island, and there's this question of where's the voice coming from, you know?
And does the girl exist? If she's on an island and she's not surrounded by people, right? Does she really exist?
Mm-hmm. There you go. Exactly.
So there's that point of, like, existence as relative to or defined by the gaze of the other.
Mm-hmm.
All this the interconnected web, and then in terms of how post-war modernity links into all of that, and the question of identity and existence, you could say that this web of being looked at and looking is interpolated by all of those objects and buildings and technology and industrialization. So now the web gets confusing, and now the web doesn't feel as coherent as it used to, perhaps. Because now we have, instead of Vittoria and Piero walking through a meadow, everything's great, sunshine and rainbows, they're standing in the middle of the Roman Stock Exchange with the huge pillar between them, and they can't even see each other, and they don't even want to see each other. They don't want to talk about each other. There's a line where she tells him, you know, I wish I loved you more, or I didn't love you at all. But this kind of paradoxical apathy of the character just shows just how much confusion there is in that space and that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and actually, you reminded me of that quote that I love so much I forgot to bring up, and that reminds me there's one last little thing I quickly want to bring up here. And,
go for it.
And that's that there's, like, a distinction that's important between love and between, like, relationship, right? Between romance, right? There's love as this, you know, just human expression, human feeling, which is seen I think in some ways, in smaller moments, with like smaller, less significant relationships, like just kind of lesser characters at certain points. But the idea that like the sort of rigors of like monogamous romantic ideals, of like it having of really needing it to be something that's like committed, it's like a full commitment, and it's like in this modern some nightmare of existentialism, how do you commit to someone like fully, so it's like it's almost like a moment of like I wish I didn't feel anything for you. When she says that, I wish didn't love you, or I loved you more, or I didn't love you at all. I wish I felt like nothing for you, so that this complicated thing where we're trying to place ourselves in a commitment in a rigid sort of identity of our relationship, that pain wouldn't happen, or I wouldn't have to lose you. Or I love you so much more, I felt so much more for you that I could just easily commit everything about who I am to you. I think that's something that's really interesting in that moment.
And that goes back to the choice of color, because choosing to film your movie in black and white is still a choice of color. It's just a choice of color by negation. And okay, fine, maybe not in a scientific sense, but I guess you could say in a cinematic sense, black, white, and gray are still colors. And
oh yeah, definitely.
And choosing to film that movie in black, white, and gray, most of the colors by default are gray, because nothing is entirely black nor entirely white, really. I mean, it's just different shades of gray. And so that gray area of I don't love you 100%, but I also don't love you 0%. I'm kind of in an apathetic middle ground here, what she told to Piero there. I think that's reflected by all of the shades of gray in that film, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. It's that space between this or that, which I think actually plays into the idea of social othering in a way too that you were talking about,
Yeah, either this or that. And when you don't choose, you might feel like, okay, there's a certain freedom because you're not forced into a solution, but it also becomes more confusing and more gray area-y.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I just thought of something too. I just thought of this like 2 seconds ago as you were saying what you were saying. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this film is that I mean, I think not being this or that is like a very natural thing,
Right.
But this film almost positions like the social aspect of modernity as like something that necessitates you to choose. It requires you to choose, and when you don't choose, it convinces you that it's nothing.
Specialization and the division of labor.
Yeah, yeah. Like the films are like trapped in these notions of like and nothingness and emptiness, but that's only because the sort of social landscape has forced them to be that, because the things they're dealing with like don't decide to be one or the other, like their relationship isn't I love you all the way and it's pure bliss and I want to marry you, but it's also not like I'm completely alone, but there's that, and that middle ground, because it's not one or the other, kind of is forced socially to fall into nothingness.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of existentialism here. A lot of emptiness.
Why are we here?
Well, oh no, please don't.
Anyways.
Oh boy. No, but oh yeah. Oh boy. Anyway. That's the thing. I feel like the modernists, so like up until World War II, they were rejecting the certainties of the Enlightenment and the positivism that came with the Industrial Revolution, and they were asking a lot of questions, right? Like, how can we deconstruct this? What is the purpose of art if now we have the camera and the motion picture. But then it's like the postmodernists came in with the 60s, and they were answering questions without the questions. That's how I feel like the past century played out. You had the modernists asking questions on mute, and the postmodernists answering questions blindfolded. That's how I feel like it. That's how it looks like to me, really. But yeah,
I love that.
I think that's pretty much going to wrap up our double feature on Antonioni. Love in times of finish the blank of the sentence. Love in times of
Let's go with. I'm gonna go with love in times of nothingness. How's that?
love in times of blank. The sentence doesn't need to be finished then. Leave the blank
there. The
there.
sentence was complete. Yeah.
Yeah. Love in times of blank. Let the blank stay there. All right. All right. But yeah, unless you have anything else to add, I think that pretty much wraps it up.
No, I think that pretty much covers most of it. Thanks so much for having me, Emma.
Thank you for coming back to the podcast series. I really do feel like you should be the co-host going forward.
I'll have to consult with my business partners, but I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, we'll meet at the Roman Stock Exchange.
Okay, perfect. Yes. Okay.
Amazing. But yeah, in the meantime, for all the rest of you, thanks for listening, and keep watching movies, keep reflecting on cinema, and keep reflecting cinema to others. Thanks again, Patrick. This was Screen View Thoughts.